In this exam skills screencast, I'm going to go through the things that I would be thinking about if I was tackling the SY1 AS Sociology exam. And from the moment that you get the paper and you look at the front cover, your mind needs to be as active as possible. So the first thing to note about the front cover of this exam paper is the time that you have to complete the exam. So remember, the SY1 paper is 1 hour, and time management, as we shall see, is a key ingredient in examination success. Now the rest of the front page of the exam paper will have these instructions, and we can see here that it says that you need to answer question 1, which is the stuff on culture, socialisation and social control, but also one other question. And this one other question is the youth culture section. And there are 2 parts to the youth culture section of the exam, a 15 marker and a 30 marker. Underneath the instruction is that you're advised to divide your time according to the mark allocation given. So what I would be thinking as I looked at the front of the exam paper is that this is really important. The paper has 60 raw marks, and this means in terms of time management it's a minute a mark. Other information for candidates that I would be thinking about is firstly this instruction about the quality of written communication. So this would be a reminder to me to think about the need to really structure my answers as effectively as possible. And then at the bottom it says that credit will be given to recent public debate, and what I would be thinking about throughout the exam is, are there things that perhaps I've seen in the news or read in a paper that I could bring into this particular exam? And you'll get credit if you are able to relate current affairs to your answers. And also this instruction says that credit will be given to recent publications. And what I would be thinking here is that I must remember, wherever possible, to develop my points by using evidence and making reference to key studies and name sociologists. So what we can see on this slide is the first section of the exam paper. Remember what I said about the importance of time management. So what I would be thinking as I turn over to this particular section is that the first question, I need to spend 5 minutes on it because it's got 5 marks, and the second question it's got 10 marks, so that's 10 minutes. So I need to spend 15 minutes on this section of the paper in total. So I'm going to go through step by step the types of things that would be going through my mind as I try to answer these 2 questions. So starting with question A, one of the things that I would be thinking is this need to use the item. So I've circled this. So one of my points must relate to either the image or the text that we can see above the question. I've also underlined this section of the first question. This question will always ask you to explain the meaning of the term, and remember that what I would be thinking is that I need to make 3 key points, including a definition that hopefully I've memorised before I've even got into the exam. If my mind went blank and I couldn't remember the meaning of the term, then I would look at the item, because the item will probably give me some clues to help jog my memory. But I would always read the question first of all and then read the item, because once you've read the question then you've got a better idea of the information that you can extract usefully from the item. This question asks you to define the term secondary socialisation, and what I would be thinking is that there are 2 elements to this particular term. There are 2 parts to it. So I would be thinking that firstly I need to define what is meant by socialisation, and then I need to make it clear what is meant by secondary socialisation. With this second question, the 10-mark question, again I'd be thinking about how I make use of the item, but also I'd be thinking about my own knowledge that I've got that is relevant to the question, because I mustn't simply copy stuff from the item. I need to develop these points in more detail, and also I need to discuss another agent of socialisation apart from the example of schools that is used in the item. And thinking about my own knowledge, I'd be thinking about the key terms and the key examples that I could apply to this question. When I'm reading through this question, I would pay attention to every single word. So we can see here, for example, that there's a very specific instruction to focus on two agents of socialisation. So I'd be thinking that one of those agents of socialisation needs to be schools, because that's the example used in the item, and remember the instruction is to use material from the item. But I'd also have to think about another agent of socialisation. Now, sometimes questions will specify that you've got to focus on a primary agency of socialisation or a secondary agency of socialisation. But in this question, you can see that it's entirely open. So I can pick any other agency of socialisation. So, for example, I might be thinking that using the media would be a really good example, because I could draw upon the specialist knowledge that we have of that particular agency of socialisation from our SY2 work. Looking at the rest of this question, I'd be thinking very carefully about the key bits of jargon that are used in this question. So agents of socialisation and gender roles. So I'd be thinking that these are terms that I need to briefly define at the beginning of my answer, and that I need to make sure that my discussion of socialisation really focuses on gender role socialisation rather than the process of socialisation in general. It's really important to read every word in the question and to stick really closely to the instructions. With the item, I'd be thinking about scanning this item very carefully for information that helps me answer these questions. So as I said, it's a good idea to look at the questions first of all, because then you know what kind of material needs to be extracted from the item. So going through this item, I would obviously make a note of the fact that it's about schools, and this is an example of a secondary agent of socialisation that I can use in both of the questions. I'd look at the picture and note that this is a female teacher, and maybe link that to the concept of role models and imitation that might be useful in relation to the second question. I would be thinking about how I could make use of some of the key terms that are used within the item. So for example, we've got key terms like cultural transmission, which is another term to describe the process of socialisation. We've got the concepts of norms and values. We've got reference to social control, which I could link to other relevant concepts such as positive and negative sanctions. And I'd be thinking about other concepts that I could use to help me apply some of this other material. So in terms of the last bit of this item, I'd be thinking about how that relates to concepts such as the hidden curriculum, or the concept of a role model, or the concept of imitation. When I turn over to the second section of the paper, I'd be thinking that I only need to do the youth culture section on this paper. So even reading through the other two sections on families and community and culture would just be a complete waste of my precious time. Once again, time management would be at the forefront of my mind. So I've got two questions to do on this section, a 15-mark question, so that of course is 15 minutes, and then a 30-mark question. So that's got to be 30 minutes, that's got to be half of the hour that I spend on the exam paper. So there are 45 minutes to spend on this section of the paper, and do remember that the last question, the 30 marker, is worth 50% of your overall mark on this particular paper. So make sure that you spend enough time on that section. The other thing that I would be thinking about as I open up this section of the paper is that with these longer questions, I really need to do a brief plan for these before I start writing. So I need to obviously read the questions very carefully again, and think about what kind of concepts, what theories, what studies and sociologists can I apply to each of these questions. So usually this 15-mark question starts with the command outline and explain the reasons. And what I would be thinking is that the examiner needs me to provide both detail and range in order to get a good mark for this section of the exam. So I would be thinking that I need to identify at least 3 different reasons, and that each reason needs to be fully developed and explained, and backed up with relevant evidence and examples. When I read exam questions, I'm always thinking, what's the key sociological debate that lies behind this question? And I think the key issue with this question is, what are the reasons for gender convergence in terms of youth culture? In other words, why are men and women now participating in a much more equal way in terms of their involvement in youth cultures? So I'd be thinking, what are 3 key reasons that would explain gender convergence in relation to youth culture? In other words, why are youth cultures less obviously masculine or feminine than they used to be? Now with this 30-mark question, this is a longer essay question, and I'd be thinking about the type of essay question that I'm faced with. And with this question, where you're asked to assess the view, I would immediately be thinking that this is the type of essay question where I'm being asked to evaluate a claim. So in this case, the claim that youth cultures can act as a form of resistance, and I would know that in terms of doing a plan for this type of question, that I need to use the 4-part essay structure. So I need an introduction, I need arguments that would support the view in the question, but also I would need arguments that go against the view in the question before drawing an overall conclusion. And I'd be thinking that within the main body of my essay, when I'm looking at the arguments for and against the view, that the best way of trying to get the maximum mark would be to write paragraphs that follow the Peel approach. So each paragraph, you identify a point, you explain it and link it to examples and evidence, you evaluate it, and you make sure that it's explicitly linked to the question set. And a good way of evaluating the arguments that you identify is to think about 3 key questions. So think about whether or not the theory or explanation overemphasizes something. Think about the key assumptions that a theory or explanation makes, and whether or not any of those underlying assumptions can be challenged. And also think about the blind spots that a theory or explanation has. In other words, what things are not explained fully, what things are left out by the theory or explanation that you've described. Once again, I'd be thinking that I've got to read every single word carefully in the question, and I need to be thinking about the focus of the question, this idea that youth cultures act as a form of resistance. So I'd be thinking that I need to explain the idea of cultural resistance during the opening of my essay, and I'd be thinking once again, what's the underlying sociological debate that lies behind this question? So for example, one way of answering this question would be to think about it in terms of the Marxist perspectives that we've looked at that emphasise the way in which youth cultures or working class youth subcultures are a form of resistance versus the post-subcultural theory which would challenge that assertion. And finally, if I did finish the exam paper with a few minutes to spare, this is what I would be thinking. So in this screencast, I've tried to model the type of thinking, the type of things that would be going through my mind if I was tackling an SY1 paper. And I think what would be a really useful thing to do, having watched this screencast, is to get hold of an SY1 paper and to write down, like I've done, the types of things that you should be thinking as you tackle the paper. And the idea behind this is to try and train your mind into thinking in a more systematic and logical way when you're in the real exam paper, rather than letting stress take over and make careless mistakes. And remember, you can find the past exam questions in iLearn in these exam skills sections. And remember, there's lots of detailed advice on exam technique for every question on the SY1 paper within these screencasts.